we can explain to the listeners why there was commemorations today. Hello and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and here in Seoul it is very early, very, very early on the morning of Saturday, the 12th of September 2020, but over in Washington, D.C., it is still the afternoon of Friday, September 11th. And my guest today is Chanel Rion. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Rion? Rion, I beg your pardon. Chanel Rion, who is the chief White House correspondent for One America News Network. Her daily broadcasts and investigative reports can be found at OANN.com for OneAmericaNewsNetwork.com. It's not often that we have the chance to interview someone with the White House in the background, so we opted to make this a video podcast instead of just the usual audio. So I hope you'll enjoy that. Thanks very much for joining me today on the show, Chanel.
Thank you, Jacko, for having me.
And you mentioned a second ago that there were some commemorative events today, and that was, of course, because it was September 11th, 19 years ago today, that those planes flew into the Twin Towers in New York and also in the Pentagon, and that one that went down in Pennsylvania. What's been the mood today in Washington with the memorials?
Very quiet, of course. We had our moment of silence observed here at the White House and elsewhere in D.C. at about 8 o'clock this morning. And we had the President and First Lady visiting Pennsylvania to go commemorate and just acknowledge the pain and the suffering and the remarkable moment that this day was 19 years ago and the loss. And so it's been very somber, very quiet. As you can see, a very cloudy day, so I don't know if the White House is blending in with the cloudiness, but
yes.
The tone that you see in the background is pretty reflective of how it's been today, a fairly quiet, somber day.
Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that you've lived in Korea before and that your mother is Korean and that you speak Korean. And your maternal grandparents lived through the Korean War, which, of course, has its own somber memories that we commemorated earlier this year with the, hang on, am I getting it right there? The 70th anniversary since the outbreak of the Korean War. Is that all correct?
That's correct, yes. My mother is a native of Seoul. I still have, my family is over there, my cousins, my uncle, my aunt, my grandmother. I spent, growing up as a child, we tried to spend about 3 months out of every year with my grandparents as a family. So my mom and my dad, and we would live with our grandparents. I learned to speak Korean then. Mm-hmm. I also learned in Korean kindergarten. So those are always good memories, fun memories for me.
Right.
I grew up in a household that really embraced and was proud of our Korean side.
And where exactly in Korea did do your grandparents live?
Well, back then, I was so little. It was in Seoul. I think it was the northern part of Seoul, but I don't know what exact neighborhood it was.
Yeah. And how would you describe your relationship to Korea?
A very proud one. I look back on how I was raised, and so much of my mother's upbringing she brought into the way she brought us up growing up. She was raised a Confucius Buddhist, and so there were all kinds of philosophies there that I feel have been very useful in my field now. And one of the more remarkable, I think, lessons that she always taught us, and my father too, was the concept that you can learn from every single experience, every single interaction, every single day. There is no person, thing, or instance that should go unnoticed as a tool to expand your wisdom. So that was something that I think has encouraged in us a spirit of curiosity that I think serves us pretty well now.
Yeah, and how would you describe America's relationship with Korea?
I think that the relationship has always been fairly strong from the war, and my family at least was of the side that was very grateful for the American intervention all those decades ago. Now we're clamping down on a little more of the trade side, which is not always fun to listen to when you're on the other side and
Sure.
your half of your home country is being berated for its trade iniquities, and you think, oh no, we were all allies, we're all supposed to be friends, aren't we?
Yep.
But I think that at the end of it all, it's for the better, and we certainly have a strong Korean community in Virginia,
Mm.
and many of them are underground Trump administration fans.
Oh, so I didn't know that he had a lot of support among the Korean American community. That's interesting.
He does. I take Uber when I ride Uber. Um, I frequently encounter a lot of Korean drivers, and we chat. I don't always dive straight into politics, but it almost becomes inevitable because
Yep.
we end up sharing our uh, our Korean heritage. We start talking about work ethic. We start talking about all kinds of topics. And I have found myself time and again in conversations that end up political. And you have these Korean immigrants talking about how this administration is good for the country, good for promoting work, and good for promoting the values that makes for strong families.
Now you have quite a good relationship with President Trump, and you interviewed him recently. Did you talk about Korea with him?
I didn't. They gave us, when we walked in,
Yeah.
Jacko, they gave us 7 minutes. We
Good
ended
God.
up getting about 12 or 13, I think, ultimately, but they gave us 7 minutes. So how many questions can you squeeze into 7 minutes? I save my policy questions for the briefing room.
Right.
I don't know if some of your viewers might know the kinds of questions that I tend to ask, but I tend to focus on the foreign policy issues. We wanted to address the North Korean issue this week, actually. There are a handful of us in the briefing room who are interested in foreign policy matters.
Yeah.
Did not get to because the room was filled with questions about one passing scandal after another that was not foreign policy related, unfortunately.
What was it in particular that made you want to talk about North Korea this week?
Well, you have this controversy, this underground thread talking about how there might be a change in succession plans, and who knows what's going to happen if there's a changing of the guard in North Korea, right? So the question is, like, is there has negotiations have clearly been on standstill, right?
Yes. Yes,
With the
since
changing
the
of the guard, is there any kind of plan in place from the administration side to try and adjust to the changing of the guard? Is there anything that they can share with us in terms of preparations on that front? I think that would be a question reserved strictly for the president or the Secretary of State, but it's one certainly on all of our minds, I think, as we talk about whether or not Kim Jong Un is still going to be in power or it's his sister.
Now, assuming that Kim Jong Un remains in power for a while, North Korea didn't get mentioned much at the recent Republican National Convention. If President Trump is re-elected in November, what do you imagine his policy stance towards North Korea will be?
The stance, I think, has not changed since the outset of this administration. That has been one of opening a line of communication that hasn't been opened before. I think that policy is going to continue. Whether or not the delegation over there in North Korea will cooperate, that's the bigger question. But there's so many with North Korea. No conversation is complete about North Korea without talking about China. So obviously we're in a situation where China is not on good terms with the United States and not foreseeably on good terms with the United States. So that's going to have, whatever happens with China really is going to be the determining factor in terms of what happens with North Korea on a baseline level.
Right. Now, are you worried that a Joe Biden presidency could have a negative effect on negotiations and relations with North Korea?
I think that a Joe Biden presidency would be harmful in the sense that at this moment, there's a healthy dose of fear on the North Korean side when it comes to dealing with the Trump administration, whether it is fear grounded on their pure policies or whether it's fear grounded in personality. the question of, oh, Trump is so erratic that we never know what he's going to do. That might be the perception that the North Korean side has, that actually plays to our advantage when it comes to diplomacy. With a Biden presidency, there's less question of strength there. I think that the Obama-Biden era was very clear about how they operated on a foreign policy scale, and it was a very hands-off, lean back, allow the other countries to kind of take ground. I think that the North Koreans will take advantage of that, and of course, as they always do, they always test the mettle of the relationship, of the leadership in the very first few months. And should North Korea test its mettle with a Biden administration, I don't foresee a Biden administration acting or reacting with strong words. I don't feel that they will actually act in a way that the North Koreans would understand.
Now, that fear that is felt in North Korea about President Trump, how does that balance with the good relationship that President Trump has with Kim Jong Un? We've heard both in the speeches and in the letters, that they have quite a good personal relationship, and President Trump has told Kim Jong Un, "We're friends." So how does that fear and that friendship, how do they play off against each other?
I think that's a giant chess game that you're watching, and in negotiation, you have a dynamic here where you're dealing with a very erratic personality in Kim Jong Un, and I think that Trump understands that. He's one of the first few leaders of a major country to understand that when you're dealing with a rogue regime like Kim Jong Un leads, it's important to ensure that there's a lot of unpredictability. We see that, certainly. I think on both sides will agree that our policy with North Korea has been not unpredictable. I think that the back and forth warm, cold relationship that we have watched with Trump and Kim Jong Un is a giant play. It's a giant strategy to help make sure that they're on their toes, because we haven't seen a purely consistent friendship. Remember, I mean, Trump would go into tangents and call him Rocket Man, and throw all kinds of ad hominem attacks, and then the next day they're best friends. That, I think, is the kind of unpredictability this administration has calculated as important to communicating with the North Korean regime in a way that they would understand. And I think that when you talk to people like Katie McFarland back in the day, when she was in the Trump administration in the early days, and she was drafting up some of the early foreign policy dealing with North Korea. North Korea's always been that enigma. The enigma that we were kind of able to deal with through the lens of China and through the lens of Russia sometimes, through the lens of Japan sometimes, but no one has quite been able to really grasp the problem that North Korea was. Who knows what the game plan is? The bottom line is that this administration, in terms of bringing on that hot-cold relationship, at least they were talking, at least they were communicating. And I think that's something that is overlooked when we discuss this problem.
Now, this week there's been a lot of talk about, in Washington, D.C. in particular, about the new book that's come out by Washington Post journalist Bob Woodward, in which he talks about the relationship between President Trump and Kim Jong Un. Also cites, I think, 24 personal letters between the two men. There's been some interesting excerpts that have come out from that in the media. Have you had a chance to have a look at any of that yet?
Have not, but I'll let you know the moment we do. It's supposed to come out next week, I think. And,
right, but there's been some pre-publication, leaks or releases, I guess, that have come out, and it's been quite interesting.
Naturally, Jocko, the leaks have been toward media that is very friendly to Washington Post. And if your readers or your listeners are familiar with One American News, we have not been the best of friends with Jeff Bezos' pet project over there.
Right. You haven't always had the smoothest of relationships with other White House correspondents. In fact, you recently set up the National White House Correspondents Association, which attracted some attention to you yourself. Why did you feel that a new Correspondents Association was necessary?
If you watch any of these briefings from beginning to end, you'll notice that of the 14 or 15 seats that are occupied. They're all occupied by a single club. It's a private club that operates monopolistically on public property. And when you listen to their questions, they all seem to be coming from the same direction. There doesn't seem to be a diversity of questions asked in that briefing room. Why? Because there are not a diversity of networks or outlets represented in that room. Why? The White House doesn't control this briefing room. This private club does. And when the private club is run by a very particular set in Washington who have very particular political beliefs, you end up with a briefing room and a White House press corps that is severely unbalanced. And so the reason we need a second group is that we simply need more balance in the briefing room. Balance in terms of viewpoints, balance in terms of outlets, because the viewpoints that are being expressed currently represent more the line of talking points of the DNC, the Democrat National Committee. And we just need balance in here. And that's why we have the second group challenging the monopoly of this private organization that has been operating at the White House for too long.
And how's that working out so far?
It's working great. I'm in the briefing room every day. I bring in a second reporter with me, and we have been rotating journalists through the briefing room. So now we have journalists in there who otherwise would not have had an opportunity to be in the room. We have brought in outlets like Epoch Times to ask their China-centric questions and their foreign policy-based questions. We bring in John Solomon's outlet, Just the News. They come in with their questions. On days when we're dealing with Israeli policy, Middle Eastern policy, I bring in a colleague from AMI Magazine. He's from an Orthodox Jewish magazine. These people, to me, are more appropriate on certain days in the briefing room and therefore need to have a presence in there. So we make sure that we have that happen. We're also working on getting a camera inside the briefing room so that we have full access for all our other members. And I don't know if you can see this, but over there is our tent, and that's where members can also use.
Oh.
I don't know if you can see that line of green, but we have a tent. And
yeah.
That's been very useful for any members who would like to broadcast from the White House lawn.
Do you have to apply for special permission to set that up?
No, I already received special permission from the White House.
Okay. Back to North Korea. There's also been, of course, recently, a couple of months ago, a book by John Bolton, former National Security Advisor, in which he argued that, among other things, the president's desire to place his personal interests ahead of the country's interests extended to his dealing with world leaders, including Kim. And John Bolton said in an interview on ABC News, if he thought he could get a photo opportunity with Kim Jong Un in the demilitarized zone in Korea, there was a considerable emphasis on the photo opportunity and the press reaction to it, and little or no focus on what such meetings did for the bargaining position of the United States. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely not. If you're going to take the argument that this president has a lot of focus on optics and a lot of focus on appearances, then it is absolutely in his interest, and you see this in his actual policy. Look at what has happened in the Middle East in the last month. Things that could not have been accomplished over the past 30 years have been accomplished within a 3-week period. It is in his best interest to have success. Optics are a huge part of that success, especially on the world scale. So I disagree with Bolton. I think that he was a very disgruntled player when he left the White House. It was a very messy divorce, and that is reflected in his writings. It is reflected in his parting perception of his former boss. And I think it's incorrect. I think that when you are dealing with a personality who is really, really intent on leaving a legacy that is reflective of his name, making his name proud, but making the country proud as well, you have a person who's going to be as interested in the optics of what is happening as much as the content. And we have seen nothing but content flowing out of this White House in the last 4 weeks on the foreign policy scale. especially on the Middle East. You have Bahrain now coming through and saying they are going to sign a normalization agreement with Israel on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
The Abraham Accords has been one of the most monumental foreign policy victories that we have seen in decades. And no one here wants to talk about it. They all want to talk about these little scandals brought about. He said, she said, he thinks, they think. It's not based on, often not based on evidence, based on hearsay or anonymous sources. These are problematic when we're focusing our foreign policy on the personality side of hearsay. That's a problem.
Have you had a chance to read all or part of John Bolton's book, in particular the bits about the summits with Kim Jong Un?
I have read excerpts. I've not read the whole book. And again, I feel that the sum total of the book is the result of a disgruntled former employee. I used to love the hawkish positions that Bolton took, especially when it came to how he dealt with China, how he viewed China. But he himself has had faux pas that really did not bode well for us as a nation, especially with regards to North Korea. When that infamous moment in the spring when he was in that interview and he made a reference about how we would view North Korean policy and alluded to us taking military action. That was something that really upset President Trump in the background. And that was something that was the beginning of the end for that relationship.
What do you think is the best way forward towards a peace with North Korea and a denuclearized North Korea?
Jacques, I wish I had the answer to that. If I did, I think I'd be in a very different position. But to me, in watching with frustration in the background how North Korea has just been this problem no one wanted to touch, it seems that regime change would be one of the only options. But we used to think that of the Middle East. And I would like to direct us back to the Middle East because it offers a very parallel, I think, discussion. When it came to how the Middle East was, how these Muslim majority countries have struck normalization deals with Israel, something that we never thought would have happened, decades. You have a model that the Trump foreign policy team has fashioned, and that is an economic-centric model, one that was presented to each of these countries in a way that they could not refuse, if you will. And that, I don't know if that will work with North Korea, but it's one model that we can look at where we took a very impossible seeming diplomatic situation, terribly fighting with Israel for decades, and solved it. You know, this Tuesday we'll watch the Abraham Accords be signed by 3 Muslim majority countries that we have watched normalize their relationship with Israel. Those were accomplished by a very out-of-the-box approach, an economic-centric approach, and whatever template they're using there may or may not work with North Korea, but it's certainly something that I'm sure scholars are studying at this point. Whether that's a template we can apply to North Korea, who knows?
Now, obviously, President Trump, as President of the United States, has to act in what he sees as the best interest of the United States. Do you ever worry, or is there a concern that the best interest of the United States might not always run parallel with the best interest of the Korean people, especially given that you've got relatives over here in Korea?
That's a good question. I think that by the United States severing its ties with China increasingly, especially on the trade front, you see the severing of ties with China, but then the expansion of trade opportunities for other countries elsewhere, Vietnam, Korea, Japan. I think that what is good for the United States is good for South Korea. And I think we will see that even more so as the United States continues to sever ties with China, and we continue to realize as a world, that China is no longer going to be that cooperative communist nation sitting on the sidelines. They're actually going to be a lot more regressive, and we're going to need allies as a result. So I think that policy that's good for the United States is, on the whole, good for South Korea, good for the the Asian countries outside of China.
But I'm thinking in particular in terms of negotiating with North Korea. We talked earlier about that, the strength that President Trump projects when negotiating with North Korea, and that injects a bit of fear into the mind of Kim Jong Un and those around him. Do you think that the alliance relationship that the United States has with South Korea limits the extent to which he can put fear into North Korea? Because South Korea and North Korea are right next to each other, and if he's tough on North Korea could get tough on South Korea.
Right. I think we've tried so many different avenues of leadership styles when it came to kind of sort of addressing North Korea, but not really. And this is really the first time that we've bluntly taken head on head, looked at North Korea straight in the face and said, you are not to mess with our allies. I think that the strength that we were discussing earlier is going to be a very important factor in preventing future situations where North Korea would use South Korea as leverage as a threat agent to try and bully allies nearby. We're in a completely different chapter of foreign policy right now. As 2020 has been a very strange year, but it's been an extremely illuminative year for foreign policy, mostly in the Middle East, but also in Asia. And I think that North Korea is going to be increasingly left out, as it has for the last 3, 4, 5 decades. It's going to be left out even more in a way that's going to be very difficult for it to survive, especially when China no longer holds the relationship it once held with the United States. Again, China is the key to so much of what we talk about when it comes to North Korea. And as China continues to have to solve its own internal domestic problems, you watch Hong Kong going up in flames, where you have this movement trying to challenge the Communist Party of China. As China turns more inward to try and deal with its domestic messes, North Korea will be left increasingly to its own devices. The more we can separate North Korea from China, the better we can actually make the economic leverage, like actual sanctions, work in a way that they will not react. And retaliate on South Korea, if that makes sense.
If you had a chance to join President Trump on a trip to North Korea to report on that, would you go?
Absolutely, and you guys will have to help me get interviews with the North Korean embassy. Hopefully we get to sit down with Kim Jong Un too.
Right. Is that something that is on your bucket list, as it were?
It absolutely is.
Yeah. Have you had a chance to come to South Korea as a journalist yet?
I have. I went and covered KCPAC. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but it was the first Korean conservative political action meeting, and they had a long lineup of well-known Korean politicians. I forget which ones they are now, so excuse me. But I went and covered that for about 3 days, and we actually went over to the DMZ, visited from afar one of the bridges overlooking the DMZ. Yeah. And we conducted a few hits. We put out a few stories, and it was an incredible honor because I had not visited Korea in 15 years at that point.
And how long ago was that KCPAC meeting?
That was last year. That was, when was it? I think it may have been last spring or last summer.
Now, you write on your website, people can find you, of course, at chanelrion.com. You write on your website that when you were growing up, you lived miles from the demilitarized zone and were able to look over and see into North Korea. What was that like?
That was a very remarkable experience. We had family up there, and I don't remember which parts they were in, but it was my uncle and my aunt, and I had 2 cousins, and when we visited them, it was always such, you knew, even as a child, I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, even as a child, I could tell the difference in life just miles away from this very foreign and very different country and its regime. It was a very quiet place. It was a very somber place. And that's what I remember as a child. Going just, miles south, you'd go back to Seoul, and it was lively and alive and lights everywhere, and it was beautiful.
Yeah.
But you could tell as a child the difference, and something was off, something was different, something was a little more serious, and that experience really did stick with me, especially as I grew to understand the context of where that quietness was coming from. My grandfather my harabuji had a brother that ended up not making it to south of the line and was in North Korea. He had not spoken to his brother in decades, had lost touch, couldn't find him. And that story always was something that he would talk about, how the tragedy of that split and the evil that was communism, holding people against their will, keeping people in ways that did not allow them to exercise their individual freedoms, the way that South Korea was able to thrive in just 2, 3, 4 short decades from nothing. What was astounding to me when I later on went and studied international relations, I ended up looking at these different examples of countries starting from scratch and how they would progress under different models, right? A very common discussion in Economics 101. And you look at how Argentina was number 6 on the GDP scale, I think, back in the early 50s, early 60s. And once they adopted this more socialistic model, their capital in the world ended up descending to a point where you have a much poorer Argentina than they should be, given their resources. And then you look at South Korea and how in the same time period it went from nothing, it went from ground zero to becoming a very thriving capitalistic nation. You see those two differences, and it made sense to me later on in college, looking back at those economic models and saying, well, clearly communism has failed wherever it was tried. Socialism is communism light, but even when you look at countries in Europe, they're so dependent on the outside world that they will never be able to be self-sufficient. That's a scary proposition, especially when you're dealing with a situation like China, where in the last year we've realized that reliance on outside powers is not always the best thing, right? So that experience, I think, really left a mark on me, especially through the eyes of my grandfather, through the eyes of my grandmother, and through the eyes of my extended family out there.
Now, we've got the U.S. presidential election coming up in just about, just under 8 weeks from now, I guess. Some people are thinking that Kim Jong Un might do something in October to get President Trump's attention, maybe a little October surprise, perhaps showcasing a new weapon at the October 10th projected October 10th military parade that they often have for the in Pyongyang. So do you think that would have any impact at all on the minds of voters in America?
I don't think so. I think that right now Americans are focused purely on COVID. Kim Jong Un, to most Americans, is still that boy who cries wolf. He acts up every springtime just to get some more attention, to get some more money from China, to get some more money from Russia. And I think that for the most part, Americans are really focused on the tensions that we're seeing in some of these bigger cities. They're focused on the virus. They're focused on, maybe on the periphery, they're worried about China. But even then, I think most of it's going to be very domestically centered as we go into the election, regardless of what Kim Jong Un does. And if we're just assuming he's going to act out in the way that he's acted out in the past, it's really not going to be that much. He's going to throw a rocket into the water, and we're going to all worry about it for about 2 minutes, and then off to the next headline. The everyday American is worried about their law and order. They're worried about whether or not their kids can go to school going into the winter time. They're worried about jobs. They're worried about domestic issues. It'll be very difficult to make Americans more interested in the Korean Peninsula, granted that nothing extra dramatic happens.
Now, are you a betting woman, Chanel?
I won't go to the casino, but yes, I am a gambling woman.
Okay. What would you bet on a President Trump victory come November?
I think there will be a Trump victory, and the question will be, how decisive will the ultimate outcome be? And that's the real problem. I think that suburban voters are trending more towards Trump. Again, if you believe in polls and you followed the polls from last spring, the tide is certainly changing, and it has to do with how people feel domestically. I believe the RNC did a better job than the DNC in conveying to the Americans that there's one party that actually will defend your property, your lives, will stand by law and order, and there's another party that won't even acknowledge it. And if they do acknowledge it, it's 3 months too late. And it's not the message that is resonating very well with suburban voters, which is really going to be an important demographic going into November 3. But it's not a question of who will win, it's a question of how long will we be sitting in the courts fighting over whether Biden or Trump won. Because looking at the numbers, it looks just like it did back in 2016. If you remember 2016, 99% of polls said Hillary Clinton was in the lead, and when election night came, it was a very different story. I believe we're going to see that again this time around, perhaps in louder fashion. But the question will be, as you look at states like California, as you look at states like Florida, as you look at these famously difficult states when it comes to voting integrity, there's going to be a big court drama. So it's going to be a lot. We're not going to be heaving a sigh of relief come November 3, is my prediction. We're going to be yammering about who won well into January.
Just like in 2000.
Perhaps. I don't know if we'll have a situation where a single court will decide, though. I think that there's just going to be so much division as both sides fight over what actually happened.
Right. Well, I want to thank you again so much for joining us here today on the NK News podcast, Chanel Rion. And do please try to get in a good couple of questions about North Korea and North Korean negotiations to President Trump the next time you're in the briefing room.
Absolutely. You guys do incredible work. I have been following NK News for several years now. Now, granted, and the last year, I have not been focusing on North Korean politics too closely, so I've had to rely almost exclusively on your updates. So I appreciate that. But thank you for having me, and keep up the good work.
Wonderful. Could you give us a quick view of the White House around before we sign off?
All right.
That's great.
That's the residence.
Yeah.
That's the entrance to the briefing room. And I'll take us into the briefing room real quick. That's the executive building where the National Security Council is, and all the other committees are that draft up policy.
Yep.
We'll walk into... Oh, I forgot my mask. Uh-oh.
Oh, yeah, you do mask up, please. Don't get in trouble.
Hello.
Do a little tour.
A tour. Hello.
Hello. Hi, we're from NK News Podcast here in Seoul, South Korea.
Oh, wow.
It's broadcasting from the morning, early morning.
Early morning?
Yeah, it's a 6:45 right now on a Saturday morning.
Wow. Well, happy Saturday.
Harrison
you.
is a deputy press secretary at the White House. He's been very kind. There we are. That's the podium.
And how much time would you often spend in here? Would you be in here for just hours every day?
No. So it depends on the briefing. Here, let me give you another shot there.
Oh, great.
It depends on the briefing. Some days are long. We have a long wait time and then a long briefing itself up to an hour. I think the longest briefing we had was about 90 minutes, and I think that was outdoors at the Rose Garden, if my memory serves me correctly.
Where is
And
that, by the
then
way?
Haley, pardon?
Where is the Rose Garden? Is that there behind you or the other side of the building?
It's that direction and to the right.
Right. That's
And
the most
that's
famous.
definitely closed off
Yeah.
on business hours. But briefings are usually, with Kaylee, the press secretary, they're usually about 30 minutes long. So you would spend maybe 15 minutes waiting in the briefing room, and then the briefing starts. So on average, I would probably chalk it up to about an hour every day in the briefing room for those days that have briefings.
And despite your political differences with the other journalists, do you get on well with them?
There's a handful of gems on campus. This is called on campus, but there are a handful of gems. Yes, there are very good people here. What's so funny, and I don't know if you saw my interview with Trump, but what I asked him about the fact that it's so interesting when the cameras turn on, you see a very different side of these people. They're very combative, they're very awful, and some of them remain that way once the cameras turn off, and others are perfectly lovely, normal individuals. So it's a mixed bag, certainly, and I can say that I have made a few friends on campus, and I am grateful for those few.
Great. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you so much for that mini tour there. And do come by and visit us at the NK News office next time you're in Seoul.
Absolutely. Hopefully it is on an official delegation, and hopefully it is for a negotiation of some kind.
That would be good. That would be momentous, yes. Thanks so much and keep well.
Thank you, Jacko.
Okay, bye-bye.